everybody, and welcome to the podcast Aftersight. I am your host, Penn Street, and today's guest is Peggy Chong, which most of you will know her as the Blind History Lady. Peggy is a published author, and throughout the work that she has done, she really has brought life to women and men in history that were blind, and from teachers to plumbers to parents and everybody in between. She's really brought these lives that really may have been lost to life, which is amazing. And I'm a big fan of Helen Keller, who is really notorious. But again, if nobody had grabbed onto her story, nobody who would know who Helen Keller is. And that story really changed my life as a little girl, finding out that I was going to be blind and learning that you can overcome challenges, and blindness is just part of who you are. It's not who you are. So welcome to the podcast, Peggy. And one of the things that you do in your storytelling is not only do you discuss the stories about these amazing people in history, but you also talk about the tools and the education that they obtained so that they could live their best lives. So welcome to the show, Peggy.
Well, thank you, Penn. It's great to be here.
Yeah. I would love you to share, how did you even get started doing this?
Well, for someone who hates to write and hates history, it is bizarre to me that I'm actually doing this and have been the Blind History Lady for about almost 8 years now. I got started because many, many years ago, back in the 70s, I have been blind all my life, and I have been involved in the blind community all my life, partly because my mother was blind. She had gone to the North Dakota School for the Blind. So I grew up in the blind community. I knew the blind rug weavers and the piano tuners and the door-to-door salesmen. And I was kind of embarrassed about them a little bit, because they had all these traditional jobs as blind people. How come they didn't branch out? Especially when you're young and you think you know it all and everything. But I was told to clean out the files when the home for the blind in Minnesota was closed. And instead of having this huge building, we now had about 1,000 square feet. So I went through the files because I would know the people. I had grown up with these people. Even though my mother was from North Dakota, the North Dakotans and the Minnesotans intermingled quite a bit because Minnesota's where the bigger cities were.
Right.
So I would go through these files, and I was reading some letters from the 1920s. Every once in a while, I'd stop and read, some of the stuff I was pitching. And this was a letter from one of our members to another talking about meeting with our blind congressman. And I thought, wait a minute, what blind congressman? How come I don't know about a blind congressman? So I put that aside because it didn't mention his name. And I paid a little more attention after that. I regret every piece of paper I threw out today, but I started with those pieces of papers. And just out of curiosity, I had to know, who's this blind congressman? And so that he's what I call my first ancestor. I have begun to think of them as our blind ancestors, our blind family.
Yeah.
And then about a little over 20 years ago, I started doing genealogy as a hobby, which that's just as addictive as chocolate or Coke. I'm here to tell you. Anyway, I would get stuck with my family on my family tree, and I a couple of times would reach over into my pile of stuff and I wonder what I can find out about so-and-so, and would do a research on that person using genealogical skills. And then when I was poking around for my family, you have to go poking around in newspapers, and in order to understand why this was important in the newspaper, when my great-grandfather got a phone call from the cattle yard in St. Paul, you got to understand what was going on
right
in the community. And I would run across articles about some more blind guys. So that's how I got started. About 9, 10 years ago, my husband basically said, you either got to do something with this stuff or get rid of it because it's taken over the den. So I did. And I wrote for Dialogue Magazine. I wrote the history column for about 6 years until Dialogue Magazine was no more. And I found it kind of surprising in the blind community when I was trying to sell my idea of researching and writing history articles about blindness, blind people, that even in the blind community, there was like, well, how are you going to find that stuff out? There's none of that stuff is around.
Wow.
And it isn't easy to find. That's true.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it because we've got so much to learn from our blind ancestors.
Yes.
I think originally I wanted to find out what the key was to being successful as a blind person. What skill did you need? What education did you need? What background did you need?
Yeah.
And basically, every time I think I have found the answer, there's 10 more blind ancestors who come and prove me wrong.
Oh.
But what is consistent is that somewhere inside of us as blind people, our blind ancestors, they had to stand up and say to themselves, now you got to cross that line. You've got to take that chance. You've got to make that move. I know you're scared, but we got to do it.
Yeah.
And it took them to do it. Nobody could do it for them.
Right.
When you look at, I think that getting good blindness training is very important. I think having a good education is very important. But there's a lot of blind people who had good blindness training and good education and stayed home and did nothing. And then there is the blind guy who, by the seat of his pants, builds a music empire, a music store empire that lasts 5 generations.
Yeah.
So
do you think, Peggy, because this is something that has always baffled me. I think even as a child, because I would meet other children who are blind and they seemed stuck, and like you said, they were scared and it was hard, and I always felt like it was a choice, and it is a choice and it's a hard choice, but this sort of question that I don't know if there is an answer to it, but why do some, even children and adults, but I even noticed it as a child, that some children, it seemed like it was a choice that they made, that they wanted their lives to stay small and they were perfectly happy with that, where other children, like I was out, playing baseball before beat ball came around, which fascinates me now. Or I was on the gymnastics team and they said, well, you can't do the balance beam because you can't see, or you can't do, and I was like, well, let me try, and I did. And some of them I were bad. But why, even as adults, I see it even in adults that are blind, where, like you say, they go through the same programs, they get the same education, but they make that choice of, I just don't have a better way of saying it, but keeping their lives small versus going out and having an impact on their community. And what have you found anything in all your research about what is that trigger for somebody to go out and become part of the community and have an impact on their community versus deciding to stay home?
As parents, if you've got 3 or 4 kids, there's the kid who is constantly in trouble and knocking over junk and climbing at 19 months and making a mess all over the house. And then there's little Mary sitting there who's really quiet, reads her books. And sometimes it's just something in us, but sometimes we didn't have that person in our life to give us that push, open that door. There are times when people who have been taken care of, they've been protected, they've been really sheltered all their lives. Yes, they may be well read, they may have excelled in school, but nobody opened the door for them. And once somebody opens the door for them and says, here's how this technique, this little piece of whatever, opens up a whole new world for them, and they take off and blossom. Where Others just don't. There's a class of students from the Iowa College for the Blind, which is what they called it back then. I'm trying to remember which year it was. It's in the 1880s anyway. And there's 6 graduates from that class. And I have been trying to study them for probably the past like 10 or 12 years because this class, all of the kids in the class, all came from families who supported them at the College for the Blind. That means that the families had money.
Right.
Because otherwise, if your family couldn't support you, you were a charge of the state.
Right.
So all of these children in that class all came from families with money. They all came from families whose parents had an education. These kids all competed. They were all highly competitive in academia, in music, in theater, which they had at the School for the Blind at that time. So they all were pretty much straight A students. They had one who went on to be one of the first female lawyers in the country, not the first blind female lawyer, but the first female, one of the first female lawyers in the country. Another went off to North Dakota and had a huge farm, became a farmer. One of them who won awards went back home to the family farm and after 3 years killed himself. So what was the difference in those? They all came from a similar background. Even their religion was all fairly similar. So this is one class that has fascinated me because they had people who went off and did really great things. And then this one guy who went off and killed himself. And I don't understand the difference in them. And so it's still a mystery to me. Hopefully someday I'll be able to solve that one and write about it. But a lot of it is the opportunities that we don't have, that we don't explore, or that we don't understand we can explore it. The knowledge, like you said, how Helen Keller made a big difference in your life. But if they didn't know about another blind people, or the only blind person they knew about was blind Tom who sold pencils on the corner, or blind Jim who sold the newspapers on the corner, and they didn't want to do that, they may have felt themselves very privileged to lead the Bible study every Saturday at church and think that was the greatest thing that they should be doing. So it's a matter of perspective, a matter of knowledge, reaching out and finding out what other blind people are doing. And that's not very easy, especially if you were living in the 1800s, early 1900s, where especially when there wasn't the medical treatment, the blind people that you knew were sheltered. They were at home. They didn't work. They didn't do anything. They went to the insane asylums because there wasn't a place for, especially women, there wasn't a place for you to go as a blind person. So you were institutionalized. Now, sometimes what has made a big difference in these people's lives is, especially before we had pensions for the blind, before we had SSI, Social Security, is they would hit rock bottom. And your choice was to be sent to the poor farm, or you could die. And the poor farm was probably worse than death. It was worse than going to jail in many, many cases. And so you took a chance on anything, any opportunity to avoid going to the poor farm. Because if you were a blind person alone and you went to the poor farm, you probably wouldn't come out. You weren't having shoes when you came out. That was for sure. Many of the poor farms shut the doors at sunset, and it was a world unto itself, and a hierarchy of, who could steal what from whom or take advantage of whom. So you didn't want to go to the poor farm. And that, because there was no safety net, I think there was a desperation in people that helped them say, all right, we have this choice. We can do nothing and stay safe as we think about it, or we can go to that poor farm. Nope, no poor farm for me. All right, I am going to try selling newspapers door to door, or typewriters door to door. It amazed me how the blind salesman who sold things door to door Many of them had college degrees,
Yeah.
and they couldn't get a job as a teacher. They couldn't get a job in a place where they could stay stationary because people were afraid they'd walk around and hurt themselves. So they
Mm.
sold things door to door. Anyway, anything from typewriters to men's suits. It always just fascinates me that the irony of not allowing somebody with a college degree to teach
Yeah.
in a four-room school in these small communities. They
Yeah.
would rather hire a 16-year-old kid
To
who
go
had
door to door.
an eighth grade education because it was safer. And the blind guy's got to go out and sell pianos, walking sometimes, 20 miles a day.
Wow. So Peggy, because I know, I mean, it's still overwhelming, the unemployment and underemployment rate for people who are blind and visually impaired. Even today, it's crazy to me reading history that some things, I mean, everything's different and better, but it's some things are still haven't changed a lot.
It's interesting you bring up employment. In the 1910 census, they specialized in looking for blind people. They wanted to do a survey of the blind in the country because there was starting to be enough rumblings from the blind community. We got to do something to help the adult blind.
Yeah.
So they took this survey and found that over 66% of blind people were employed, that they were not on public support. They weren't being taken care of by a family member. So you've got, let's just say 35% of the unemployed were either being cared for by a charity or being cared for by family members, not supported by themselves. Now, the standard of living is far different.
Yeah.
Because we had a lot of blind guys who were farm laborers at that time, and they lived in the bunkhouses with the other sighted cowhands and farm laborers and so on. So, I mean, that's something that people would not necessarily aspire to today, or they were living in the back garage of someone's house, a carriage house or something like that, and had a broom factory of their own. And supporting themselves and not supporting themselves well, but they kept themselves fed and they paid the rent and they were not part of a charity.
Right.
So in a sense, our unemployment rate has gone down over the last 100 years considerably.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that life was better back then? I don't think so.
Yeah.
By any means, but we are not getting as many opportunities as we used to, I think, because people are worried about being sued, worried about insurance. I don't think our blind guys are taking the chances that they used to. I think it's a lot harder to start your own business. A lot of these people started their own businesses, like running a broom shop out of their own home, or a small grocery store out of their own home. Today, you don't do that. You don't start a grocery store in your house. There are laws against that.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So in a sense, we were better off employment-wise in one way, shape, or form in 1910 than we are today. However, the quality of living is probably far better today than it is then.
Right. And I know that, the government assistant programs that we have now helps with that quality of life, where I don't think that was so much an option in 1910.
There was no option in 1910 for, you could get public assistance, but you worked hard not to do that, because if you got public assistance, your name went in the paper. And if your name was in the paper that you had gone to the city hall or the county, and that was basically your options, there was very little assistance for state help back then. Your name was in the paper and everybody in the neighborhood knew, hey, John and Mary, you aren't taking care of your blind son, George. We have to do that. Shouldn't you be taking care of him? Shouldn't you be taking him in? They were shunned at family members were shunned at church. So you almost had to separate yourself from your family, move to another community.
Wow.
if you were going to get public assistance,
Wow.
if you wanted to protect your family from being shamed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know when I talk to others who are blind and visually impaired and about their employment and things, it seems that it really it's who you know, pretty much almost every single job that I've had in my career, not all of them, but a lot of them, it's because I knew somebody who was willing to give me the chance.
Same
And
here.
yeah. And I mean that's fantastic because I've had an incredible career thus far. But it's also frustrating, you know, and then of course when COVID hit, I lost my job that I thought I was going to be in until I retired, just like so many people around the world. But the biggest thing that scared me was not only was I competing in a terrible job market, but everybody was competing for those jobs now. And the first thing was that overwhelming statistic of people who are blind and visually impaired and that unemployment rate. And it scared the bejeebas out of me, you know. And but it also motivated me that take whatever you can get. It may not
Yes.
be what you're gonna. And I did. I had many contract and small part-time jobs and until I landed at Audio Information Network of Colorado. And but it's scary out there. And it's something that I've always advocated for is we need to hire blind people.
Well, and especially for women in
Yeah.
Colorado here, some of the women have been just fantastic stories for me. This one lady named Charlton, she wanted to teach music in college. She wanted to be a concert performer and had the skills to do that. But nobody wanted to take her on at the university level. They didn't even want her to go to the University of Colorado.
Wow.
So she ended up opening up her own music studio in her small rented rooms, which grew. So she rented a house and that grew. So she had two offices downtown, two music studios downtown, had to hire a manager and a secretary,
Wow.
and taught the master's classes for the University of Colorado's music programs to teach the teachers how to teach music in our public schools and college levels. Now, she couldn't teach in the public schools. But she taught the teachers.
Wow.
And so she didn't have the career she wanted, but she was a very successful woman financially. She retired early because she got married, and that's what women back then did in the 30s, is you weren't a working wife.
Right.
Although she did continue to teach some music classes for certain students, but she ended up doing a lot of Braille transcribing here in Colorado because we did have a public library in Colorado that provided books. The Denver Public Library provided Braille books, and a lot of that was hand transcribed by the Red Cross and blind volunteers.
Wow.
And she did proofreading for that. So she had quite the collection of Braille books when she passed away.
Wow.
But she turned all of her lemons into lemonade.
Yes.
And those are really good stories that that's what I write about.
Yeah.
Those kinds of people. Helen Keller, lots of people have written about her.
Yes.
That's great. Louis Braille, same thing. No,
Yeah.
I write about the Charltons, and I write about the one person I'm writing about right now, putting his story together, is a man from Alabama named John Lafferty, who went blind about 1870 playing with bullets. Don't do that. He was shooting them off as fireworks on the stove, and one went awry. Anyway, he went to the School for the Blind in Philadelphia, which was a quality school at that time, had national reputation, along with Perkins. And he ended up going down to teach in Louisiana at the School for the Blind there, where he met his wife. And then he went to Alabama and he taught there for a few years.
Wow.
But all the time he had his own piano tuning business.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turned his piano tuning business into classes at home. And then he started this Laverty music store in Talladega at about 1888. And they finally closed the music store in the 2000s. The fifth generation couldn't get the sixth generation to take it over.
Oh,
but he had two branches. I mean, he had this big house in Talladega with
Wow.
pillars, and he had farmland, and he had the music stores, and he had stock and train companies and mining industries. And
Wow. I love that. Like I agree. That's one of the reasons we started Aftersight is because, the Helen Kellers and even Eric Weimer, who's a friend of mine, and I love you, Eric, but he's the first blind person to summit Mount Everest. Those stories are fabulous, but people are really hungry for, like you said, the Charlton stories,
yes,
the stories that
the average person like me. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like
exactly.
me. Somebody like me. Oh, I can't be like Eric Weinmeier.
No.
I can't even climb 6 flights of stairs,
Exactly.
And I followed his climb very closely, and I think that was great. But yeah,
yeah.
He's not me.
Exactly. So I think it's awesome that that you are sharing these stories that really would have gotten lost along the way because people don't shine lights on those kinds of stories. So Peggy, how can we find out more about you? I know you have a new book coming out, but you also have books that have already been published. How can we follow you and keep track of you? And
you can, first of all, I have a monthly email list. So if you want to contact me, my email address is theblindhistorylady@gmail.com. That's all one word, theblindhistorylady@gmail.com, and I'll put you on my monthly email list. I have a book available over Amazon and Barnes and Noble called Don Mahoney, Television Star. It's about a man who had to hide his blindness for 10 years in the TV industry when it was brand new, until he had this huge television audience that loved him. And then, well, I can't hide the blindness anymore. So, but I'm also self-published on Smashwords, and that's all one word, Smashwords, SMASHWORDS.com. And just type in Peggy Chong or The Blind History Lady. And I have about a dozen books up there that you can download. Please, as blind people, download them in a Word or a text format. Don't download them in another way, or you have trouble reading them.
Exactly.
But yes, I have a monthly email list, and I talk about Charlton Harris, and I talk about John Laverty will be one of my short stories, probably, in the fall and so on. But a lot of the blind people average blind people who not all built an empire like Laverty, although there are more than you would suspect.
Yeah.
But people who just, they supported their families. Their children went on to college, which not all of the neighbors could do that.
Right.
They bought their own homes. They maintained their own homes. They had to work hard at it. But, if you want to get anywhere in life, you do have to work hard at it. And I try to highlight the tools that they used to be successful.
Yeah. And that's so important, Peggy. And Peggy, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And we will put all of Peggy's contact information and how to find her books and also join her list. We'll put those in the notes in the podcast so that you can have access to those. And have a wonderful day, Peggy, and everybody out there. Be kind to yourself and find a way to have a positive impact on the people around you. And sometimes you just do that with a smile. So again, Peggy Chong, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Penn.